when the history of the pandemic is written, manufacturers should get an entire section to themselves. So brilliant was their response to the crisis. Equally, of course, we should not forget the toll it has also taken on many companies. The first draft of history is in fact already being written by Professor Tim Minshall and his team at the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. Tim, a very warm welcome to the programme. In all the research you've done so far, what has stood out for you most about the way manufacturers responded?
Thanks for that very kind introduction. I think for us, there's been so many positive things, and perhaps grouping these under three broad headings. There's been something incredibly positive about demonstrating the value of manufacturing. Manufacturing has become clearly, we know it's important, it's clearly important to our economy, but it's become ever more visible thanks is a strange way of putting it, as a result of the pandemic, making manufacturing more visible. People now realize more and more perhaps where things come from and how easy it is for things to go wrong and the impact that things going wrong has. There's been that side to it. There's then been a sense that manufacturing clearly is important and it must survive and thrive because it has a key role to play in our future, as we all know. And then there's been the third bit, which is the response of manufacturing companies to specific COVID crises. So I think those three bits to me really stand out in this, as you kindly put it, the first draft of the history of this. It's demonstrating manufacturing's importance, ensuring we do things to ensure its survival and growth, but also what's been done in the short term to address real, urgent, critical problems.
You talk about lead learners, those who light the way for others. What did you identify about them, and can you describe those companies to us?
Yes, so when we did a little bit of work supported kindly by the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, just saying, look, some companies have done amazing things. Why don't we look at those companies in a little more detail? And they're typically smaller companies, sometimes not even companies. They were organizations involved in manufacturing, just to see what they'd done. And could we see different types of responses? And could we also see what lessons could be learned if we ever need to, sadly, as we will do, face crises in the future? And so we found a whole bunch of things from these wonderful companies all across the UK. And one of those interesting examples was the way in which some companies were able to move forward quite fast and not only do something remarkably useful for the NHS and others in the healthcare ecosystem, but to do it in a way that gave lessons to others. So perhaps a quick example of this. Here in Cambridge, as with many other places, we have a strong maker community. So it's a public facility. We have membership and people come in and they have access to machines to make things. And many of the people involved in that community are from manufacturing firms. And some of them are from medical device manufacturing firms. So when the crisis struck, they wanted to do things. They saw the shortage of PPE striking the whole country and they said, we want to do something about this. But they knew that just charging forward at great speed and making stuff and turning up to the hospital with a load of stuff going, here you go, would be not very helpful, because the hospital quite understandably would say, how did you make these? Have they been sterilized? I know what happens if any of these go wrong. So luckily, within this community in Cambridge, we had some people who understood high volume manufacturing in a healthcare environment. They understood about good practice. They understood all of the things that are well known for those in that sector. They applied those lessons to developing a response to the local hospital and the wider community. And very importantly, published all of that information. So they created a resource for anybody to say, if you want to do this, it's not just this is how the product is designed. It's also about you need to make it in this way, using these materials to make sure they're all traceable. You need to demonstrate it has been delivered in a certain standard. And if something, heaven forfend, were to go wrong with the product, they can trace it straight back and improve things in the future. So simple, well-executed things shared with other people allowed others to benefit from this.
It's no secret that supply chains came under enormous pressure and thus under significant scrutiny, talk of reshoring and so on. The pandemic really demonstrated what happens when supply chains are not nurtured.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And unfortunately, the debate got a bit polarized. It sort of at times implied that all long supply chains are bad, everything should be locally manufactured. And of course, the truth sits between these 2 points. Long supply chains can be absolutely fine if there is resilience and robustness in them to allow them to cope with sudden changes. And I think it was the shock and the fact that it was pandemic in nature meant that the original long supply chains for certain products, such as PPE, could not be sustained. But unfortunately, because there was relatively little domestic manufacturing capability, there was a gap between these 2 points. It recovered, the system is working okay now, but at the time, it was a real shock. But I think that the debate that it goes from long chains bad, must do everything locally, is not helpful. What we need to say is we need to have these two things in balance. At times, local manufacturing is incredibly helpful. At other times, for all sorts of reasons to do with cost and volume, actually having your products delivered from wherever is cheapest, the appropriate price at the appropriate quality for you, long supply chains, of course, absolutely fine.
Yeah, but in terms of companies who prospered, if they were able to prosper because of the nature of their business, those that did really well were the ones who had looked after their supply chain partners. And I suspect that is going to be a significant factor going forward for UK manufacturing, that they will actually nurture their supply chains better and not take supply chains quite so much for granted.
It's a really good point. So I think there are two aspects to that, if I may. One is that for those companies who did repurpose, so they're addressing this issue of we make product X, which is not a medical product, but there is demand for a medical product, typically PPE. How can we shift to doing that? And of course, with our wonderful manufacturing base, we had excellent companies with great machines and superb people. But actually, that wasn't the bottleneck. The bottleneck was having enough supplies to make this. And suddenly trying to build a supply chain from zero in an area that you're not necessarily familiar with was incredibly difficult. And then we ended up to the second point with this issue of, but if you have built that relationship with these raw material suppliers and component suppliers, and you're doing it just in response to a crisis, the crisis will end, emphasizing that very strongly, and you then go back to a different set of suppliers. So how much effort do you put into nurturing your supply chain, knowing that you may not need it in the longer term? However, we saw some great examples of not just firms who were responding to a crisis, overcoming supply chain problems, but then also saying, wow, this is a new business opportunity area for us. And having built that supply chain, they're then very well positioned to take it forward. And we've seen an example here locally in the Cambridgeshire area of a company that is not at all in medical technologies, responded with one product, which then built a great relationship with their suppliers and with the local healthcare system, which has now allowed them to introduce another innovative product that they wouldn't perhaps have dreamt of making before.
I think it's important, and I think everybody recognises that the future for manufacturers, as indeed for the entire nation, cannot look 100% like it did in the past before the pandemic. Changes that have had to be made will embed themselves. There's one change that you want to have happen because you say there is a disconnect at the moment between manufacturing and the ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem. What do you mean by that, and why is that so important when we talk about the future of the sector in this country?
So I think the point I was clumsily trying to make, and I need to get better at this, was to make the point that there is a value chain which says, okay, well, we do research, we develop products, we make products, and we ship and support products, and then there's a whole product life cycle and feedback, all that classic, well-known stuff. However, what we saw and are seeing occasionally is this idea that bit at the left-hand side, the bit that says this is about developing new products, about doing the research and developing the new technologies, that is innovation. And then you take the outputs of that and you get it made and you get it to the customer. We would argue, and many would argue very strongly, that whole process is innovation. And if you overemphasize and isolate the bit at the beginning and say, let's just do more of that, expecting everything just to flow through, that's just not how it works. And particularly not now with the nature of manufacturing, with its interconnectivity with services and servitization. The fact we're talking about innovation being the development of advanced manufacturing processes. It's the development of approaches that allow us to take the outputs of the latest biomedical research, the latest material science research, and get it into useful products and services. You can't do that if you separate out the development bit and the production bit.
Tim, a final lesson that you suggest we should all learn from this, and we do have to learn all these lessons from what's been going on and what is still going on, is that crisis mode may bring out the best in us, but it's not optimal for a stable sector moving forward. We can't just live like this forever. We've got to learn and settle down.
I never want to be accused of, standing on the sidelines and making, suggestions that are easy to make and impossible to implement. But I think there is something that many would agree on this point, which is there are two different things, and we should be good at both of them. One is the ability to respond to a crisis and to respond to changing market conditions, to respond to changing environmental conditions, whatever. There's a dynamic bit, but there's also an ordinary bit, the ability to execute, to plan, to execute to that plan and make sure that everything just works. And I think perhaps at times, those two things are not given equal weight. And the assumption perhaps sometimes is we'll do as much planning as we can, but it's okay because we know that when a crisis strikes, we'll be able to respond to it very effectively. And I don't just mean pandemic, I mean a crisis being a change in market conditions, the emergence of new competition. And I think it's just always keeping in mind, as the great entrepreneur and academic, a guy called David Teese at Berkeley often talks about, you need dynamic capabilities and you need ordinary capabilities, and you need them both in balance. They're equally important.
And I suppose for companies who might say, how do I manage that? There has to be advice out there to help them do that, because an awful lot of this has just been reactive behavior. It hasn't been planned behavior, and trying to encapsulate that and ingrain both bits into the way we run companies might be quite tricky for some people.
It is, and it's one of those frustratingly easy things to say, incredibly hard to do things. But it would be a crying shame if the fantastic experience of doing that dynamic thing during the pandemic, those wonderful experiences, that heroic efforts across the manufacturing sector, if the lessons from that were only that, yes, if everything goes wrong, we can respond. It should be, look how well we worked there. Picking up on some of Dick Elsey's comments from the UK Ventilator Challenge, look at the great way we worked in that crisis. How much of that can we bring across to our day-to-day working environment? And if we could, wouldn't that be fantastic? And then you can use that to supplement the ordinary capabilities you have to execute at the right time, at the right cost, at the right quality for the day-to-day business.
And that sounds to me like the basis for a strong, resilient manufacturing sector going forward. Tim Minshall, thank you very much indeed for being with us. We really appreciate it. This has been a special report from Sanute TV. I'm Nick Peters. Thank you. See you again soon.